Okay, you got a couple choices. You can either admit defeat now, declare Colorado not just the victor on Saturday, but why not the national champion? And why not crown them today? Why not just, go ahead and say that they're going to beat Nebraska on Saturday, win it all, and college football forever has been changed by Deion Sanders. Well, we can go that route, or we can talk about reality. And that's what I'm going to do in this video. I'm Don Collins, this is the Don Collins Show, and I'm going to talk to you about not just why it's possible, but I think probable that Nebraska will win the game against Colorado this weekend. And I know everybody, the national media, Colorado fans, certainly Deion, and lots of Husker fans disagree with me. Well, maybe, but maybe not. We'll talk about that. I'd like to talk to you about 4 games that set up the game this weekend. Game number 1, Nebraska versus Minnesota. Now keep in mind that Nebraska this year had tape on Minnesota, had plenty of time to prepare. And keep in mind that Matt Rule said exactly what Nebraska would do, not just in the Minnesota game, but in any game this year. Nebraska was going back to smash mouth football on both sides of the ball. It was going to be controlling the time of possession, and Matt Rule talked about smashing and hitting and grinding. And that's exactly what Nebraska did. Truth is, Minnesota is lucky to have escaped with a victory in that game. Nebraska on paper, and I know it wasn't, the scoreboard doesn't care about on paper, but Nebraska on paper dominated that game. Did exactly what Nebraska wanted to do. Save for ridiculous, egregious turnovers at the worst possible moments, unforced by the way. Penalties also unforced at egregious moments. Bad clock management and some bad play calling by the coaches in the second half. Nebraska, without that, wins the game going away. Now you may say to yourself, wait a second, you're making excuses. No, I'm not. If you saw my video immediately after the game against Minnesota, you know exactly how I feel about that. But here's the thing. Those are all things that Nebraska can work on. The fundamentals, the engine of that vehicle is strong. The defense is elite. This is not a Nebraska of last year or even 2 or 3 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. This defense was hitting people. For the first time, I don't know that I've seen a Nebraska defense like that in a decade. Go back to Bo Pelini. Go back to his coaching days. And Nebraska brought a style of play that Matt Rule said was going to happen, and it did happen. And save for things that Nebraska can control, that is a Nebraska victory, one that Nebraska wasn't supposed to win. I did not pencil them in to winning that game in my prediction video for the year. So the first thing you need to realize is Nebraska played a Minnesota team they weren't supposed to beat and had that game except for mistakes they did to themselves, not because of Minnesota. The second game I want to talk to you about is the Colorado TCU game. Now, there's a game that's literally opposite in every way. Number 1, TCU had exactly, no footage. No footage, no film on Colorado. Not as a team, of some individual players, yes, but as a team, looking at the way the offense was going to be run, the defense, the different schemes, all that, no, nothing. In fact, Colorado represented the single greatest mystery anyone has ever seen in college football. There's never been a team, never, with that kind of turnover, from the coaching staff all the way down to the water boys. It's never happened. All the players are new. In fact, Deion made a point of explaining what he was doing when he got there, much like Matt Rule. He was going to flush everything out, rebuild in the image that he wanted. Well, he got that, but the price that teams like TCU would play, or any team that took Colorado first, and TCU drew the short straw. Nobody would have wanted to play Colorado in game number 1. But the price that a team like TCU paid is TCU had to play the greatest unknown college football has ever seen. Now, just for a moment, let's assume that Deion's a good coach, and let's assume that his staff is good, and let's assume that the players are good. If you assume those things, and you assume that TCU had absolutely zero footage of any of that, then check this out. Even with all of that as an albatross around TCU's neck from the get-go, from the start of that game, even with all of that, all Colorado could do is win by 3 points. And all they could do, wait a second, is what basically every team did with TCU last year, getting a track meet and TCU won more of those games than not. And Colorado, although their offense looked fantastic, their defense got hammered. Their defense is not in the top, I think Adam Carricker mentioned maybe in the top 50. I don't see how their defense is in the top 75, maybe 100 teams. Their defense allowed so many points and so many yards. So while everyone's crowning Colorado as national champs all of a sudden and that Nebraska's got no chance, what they did was basically like what teams like SMU did last year to TCU when TCU had a better team. When TCU had a quarterback who didn't have just 150 attempts under his belt like Chandler Morris has, a quarterback that was a multi-year starter, a veteran, someone who had been around the program for more than just 15 minutes. And all Colorado could do is allow 266 yards on the ground, which Nebraska is going to exploit, and win by 3 points. And if you watch the game, you know that TCU made serious mistakes to themselves, much like Nebraska did against Minnesota. And you also know that they did something that Nebraska won't do and other teams won't do, and that's get into a shootout with Colorado. The third game I want to talk to you about is a game last year, and that's an SMU game. You see, against SMU, TCU with a better team, with a better defense, radically overachieving we now see, and we understand from the national championship game, which I'll also get to in a moment. TCU allowed SMU to have a quarterback throw for almost 400 yards, and offense in SMU run up almost 500 yards of offense against them. And like TCU did all last year, allowing over 4 touchdowns in that game, 31 points, but allowing, TCU did last year, over 4 touchdowns a game, almost 29 points a game. Now it's important that we talk about SMU, and here's why. Here's the nuanced thing I want you to remember. TCU had film on SMU. TCU had years of experience playing SMU. They knew the players and the coaches, and they knew everything you'd want to know about SMU and other teams they played. And SMU, with all of that TCU had as an advantage, still rolled up those offensive yards and points against TCU. So if you look back at SMU and then you look at the entirety of the entire TCU team last year, you can either think that TCU just happened to play a bunch of teams who had their best game of the season against them, or TCU allowed a lot of yards and a lot of points, and then finally in game number 4 were completely exposed and obliterated and embarrassed in the national championship game. A game which many people saw coming. A game which I'm not just harping on. Now go back and watch my video from last year at the end of the season where I talked specifically about that national championship game and what an embarrassment that was for TCU and exposing them for what they were, overrated. Now right now, I think that the line is something like 3 or 3.5. Okay, fine, the edge going to Colorado. My friend Connor Hayden says if it gets to 3.5 or 4 points, he may have talked about this in his most recent video, he's taking that all day long. He, I think like Adam and like me, believe that it's not just possible but probable Nebraska can win. But the way they're going to have to win is, number one, no more, and I'm going to say no more than 2 turnovers. No more egregious turnovers. I don't think it's going to happen. I think they're going to hold on to the ball, but you can't have 4 turnovers against Colorado. Number 2, the coaches have got to play to their, they have to, play, no pun intended, to their players' strengths. You can't have Jeff Sims in the second half, time winding down, Nebraska in control, up by 7 points, able to burn all sorts of clock. You can't say to Jeff Sims, go bombs away. You can't do it. You have to stick to what you said you would do coming into the season. That's give the ball to your running backs. Let them pound and pound and pound. Wear them down. Third of all, you can't have terrible clock management. There were 2 timeouts burned in the second half of the game last week, Nebraska versus Minnesota, that should not have been burned. And then at the end of the first half, the refusal to use a timeout and slow things down with multiple downs ahead of you from the half-yard line, that can't happen again. Nebraska's going to have to take advantage of all their opportunities to score, slow the game down, control the clock. And finally, Nebraska's going to have to do on defense to Colorado what they did to Minnesota. Shut receivers down in tight coverage and hit hard. Now, if Nebraska can do those things, which are things that they could have controlled last week, I think they can control this week, Nebraska can win. And a lot of y'all have already given up. A lot of y'all have already said, oh, it's not possible. Listen, Nebraska's played accurate quarterbacks before. Nebraska's played quarterbacks with teams with fast wide receivers before. Nebraska's played difficult games in difficult spots, in difficult situations against hot opponents many, many times. In the last 5 years, it's happened against Ohio State, it's happened against Michigan and Michigan State. I can go on down the line of all the teams Nebraska was close to. The Oklahoma game last year, many games that Nebraska had against tough opponents. And Nebraska was very close to winning games that I don't think if they're close against Colorado, they're going to lose. So have heart, Nebraska fan. Remember, this means something. It means something to me. And if you have a chance to watch the game in person, if you're in Colorado, cheer and boo when it's appropriate. I can tell you the most appropriate time to boo is anytime Colorado has the ball. Hey, listen, I don't like the way I ended that video, or the ending that I had was not as smooth as I wanted it to be. So let me be very direct with you. Have heart. Don't throw in the towel. It ain't over. It's just one game. It will not define the season, or it won't define a career for anybody, no matter what happens. And as always, go Big Red.